Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video today, I'm going to show you how to paint these beautifully realistic watercolor gourds, but they're actually a lot simpler than you may think. We're going to be using some basic watercolor principles. I think you'll really enjoy it. So let's get started. My favorite watercolor paper right now is Baohong. I'm in love with the texture. I can get it very wet and mess around with it, and it behaves well. My limited palette of cad yellow, magenta, cerulean, indigo, sap green, and then I'm bringing in some cad orange and a half pan from another palette. And I'm also going to be using a Princeton round size 10, but you can really use any round brush. Okay, so here's my reference picture. It's pretty chaotic, but if you Google search gourds, you will find so many different shapes, so many different colors, so find one that speaks to you. In this video, we're going to talk about the basic principles of painting all gourds while I paint a gourd. So you don't necessarily have to follow this one exactly. If you follow the techniques in this video, you can paint any gourd that you want. All right, so my first very important tip to painting gourds is to use the lightest wash in the lightest color of your reference. So I am looking at a ribbed gourd that has a lot of really light cream, light yellow colors. So I'm going to paint the entire shape of my gourd this very light wash of yellow. So a light wash means more water than pigment, and you can see that while I'm painting the general shape of the gourd, I am adding more water and more pigment just to mess around with how much pigment is in the shape. I don't want it to be very saturated. I want it to be pretty light, and you'll see why in just a minute. So I like to actually use paint to shape the gourd instead of sketching it, because I feel like I get a very natural and realistic shape if I am not trying to follow an outline. So we're just using that light wash to get the basic shape of our gourd. Now we've got that basic shape, we can start adding in the details. So I have tapped my brush on my paper towel off the page, and now with a thirstier brush, it's more damp, I am picking up paint in little swipes where this gourd has those lighter ridges. Now this does two things. It is removing paint, so I have a lighter area, but it's also removing some of the water. So now I'm going to drop in some of the color that is between those lighter ridges, and that area in the middle between the swipes is more wet. So we're going to get a nice wet on wet blend between those lighter sections, and it's not going to blend into those lighter sections. So it's a great way to lift some of the pigment and the water out, and you can still use those wetter areas to blend some of your colors in. Earlier this week, I did a video on basic watercolor principles of wet on wet and wet on dry. So this is kind of that video in action, where we start with wet on wet. So everything in this base layer, we are trying to accomplish wet on wet. And then we're going to let it all dry and then add the details, wet on dry. So I'm looking at the reference picture, and between those lighter ridges is a great blend between orange and green. So I'm just trying to add those colors in while everything is still wet, blend them together, and leave the lighter ridges alone as much as possible. Also, if you do go into those lighter ridges, you might have seen with the green, you can just rinse your brush, tap it onto a paper towel, and use a more thirsty brush to pick that paint up and maintain those lighter areas. Keep in mind that everything on this base layer is supposed to be light, and it is supposed to blend together. This whole base layer is about telling the color story. We're not focused too much on the details. We just want to block in the color where we see it on our reference picture and maintain the highlight and the light areas, because they're very hard to bring back, especially if it dries. So we're going to focus on light washes of color, blending it together and getting the basic color blocking down, and then leave it alone, let it dry. Painting mini gourds at one time is a great way to do this because we can let this one dry and move on to a different gourd and paint the base layer for that one. I had someone recently ask me what others have previously called wet on damp. In my opinion, damp is just another way to say that it's almost dry, so it's not totally wet. I still consider wet into damp, wet on wet. It's just another way of saying wait for it to almost dry so that the blend is not as significant. It stays a little bit more. So at this point, it is more damp and we're getting less of a full blend and more of a concentrated blend, which is also really great. So any stage at which the painting is wet, you can continue adding paint and get some kind of blend. All right, so we're going to let that one completely dry so that we don't mess with it anymore and we can come back and add more of the harsher line details with wet on dry. So we're going to do another gourd, and I wanted this one to be a more pinky orange for a base color, so we're going to do the same thing. A very light wash that is more watery than pigmented, and we are painting the entire shape of the gourd with that initial light color watery wash. You'll also notice that as long as the edges of the gourd are still wet, I can mess with the outline. So if I don't like the way the neck is curved, I can fix it. If I want it to be a little bit bigger or straighten aside, I can do that because it's still very wet. So I have had comments that I move very quickly, I paint very quickly. This first layer of wash, it's kind of the move your booty stage. We gotta go fast. And it's great because it's not the detail stage. It's the let's get down the color blocking stage and let everything blend together, because we need to go fast so that it's not drying and we get the blend. So I don't want the hard lines to form before I have completely fixed the edge of my gourd. And now it's still significantly wet enough that I can drop in these green details. One of the keys to making these gourds look very realistic is to think about how the stripes and the ridges would be shaped along a round object. So you'll notice that my lines on the gourd are curved out on either end and a little bit straighter in that center one, and then very, very curved on the other ends. Using the wet on wet technique is where watercolor magic happens. We are just blocking in the colors. We've got those beautiful green lines on the gourd, and the watercolor is doing its magic. It's spreading out organically, randomly. We have no control, but that's what makes it so beautiful. So try to let go of control and just let that color blend and do its thing. You're just placing those lines, placing the dots, letting the wet on wet technique create something beautiful as you work very quickly to make sure it doesn't dry before you're able to put that paint in. Something that's also fun to do is to add a contrasting color while you're still doing the wet on wet technique. So I did add a little bit of indigo to my sap green and did a few dots while it's still wet to get a contrasting blend. So not just that first initial layer, but also a contrasting color can be really cool, and then they blend together. So experiment with different colors in this first layer. And again, we're placing all of our color story down in this first layer, and then we'll come back to it and add some of the finer details. So don't get caught up too much on the details and where everything needs to be, just placing the initial ideas of color, and then we will come back to it. I added a little stem on the top and a little bottom bump, whatever that's called. And this is an opportunity to have fun. The direction of your stem, how it's forming, the size of it. The angle also really helps tell the story of how your gourd is shaped, the roundness of it. So anyway, have fun with your stem. And then I'm also going to be adding a contrasting orange color as well while it's still wet. Just a little bit. That contrasting color needs to be a little bit kept in check. It's not the main priority. Its brightness and its contrastingness already makes it stand out, so we only need a little bit to go a very, very long way. Okay, so now we're going to leave it alone and move on to our last gourd. This gourd, okay, I was inspired by the super bright orange and almost blackish blue gourd that you can see in the reference picture. It's very intense, and I will admit, I wasn't sure how this one would turn out, and then it ends up being my absolute favorite. So wait until the end to see how amazing this pops with all the details and shadows. But anyway, I'm starting with a pretty bright and saturated color. And I said in the beginning with the other two gourds to not really do that. But the lightest color on this gourd in my reference picture is this color. It's a very saturated gourd, so that's okay. So we're looking at our reference picture to determine the lightest wash of color that we need. It's still pretty watery. I'm moving really fast. I'm using that color everywhere to create the shape and move the angles around and create the edges. But yeah, our main color, that base color, is pretty saturated in this one. So I took the leap. It was kind of hard, and I went full force into this beautiful orangey magenta color. But the same principles are applying here as well, where while it's still wet, we need to move pretty quickly and start dropping in those colors that really define this particular gourd. So I did full on orange at the base to give it a little more oomph of saturation of color down at the curved bottom. And then this gourd seems to go from almost a blackish color to an indigo color to a green color. So I'm doing a very similar green stripe as the gourd in the middle, keeping it a little bit lighter. They're a little bit thinner, but then they come together at the neck of the gourd and kind of merge together, and then they're going to turn into a very dark blue. So I'm trying to get all of that color placed in while it's still wet so that we don't have any super harsh lines at this point, and we're still getting some of that blending, diffused look. Now, we could have used indigo in the beginning. When we're forming the gourd, we could have done, that circle base in the bright orange red, and then done an indigo neck that connected and blended instead of painting the neck red, since we're completely covering it up with indigo. But I think the beauty in doing the whole entire shape of a gourd one color is that you can mess around and fix it without any color diffusion yet. And then you can kind of control where that color is diffused and where it's placed. So we've got that indigo along the neck. It kind of blends down into the green, and then the green is blending just slightly into that orangey red. The curves of the green on this one are also giving the gourd a lot of its shape, because this is a 2D object that we're trying to make look very round and realistic. So how you curve those green markings on your gourd are really going to define how it feels, how the shape is. But also that little bottom bump on the bottom of that gourd, I placed a little bit on top instead of completely below, and it also makes it look like you're seeing the bottom of that gourd a little bit, so it's angled a little bit more. So everything that you place helps tell the story of a 3D object that's actually flat. All right, now I've picked up a smaller round brush. This is a round size 3, and this is where we get to have a lot of fun. The other part was fun too, but it's fun because we get to take our time and we get to focus, and we do have a little bit more control. Nothing is bleeding and blending away from us because now we are using wet on dry. Wet on dry is when we get to use lots of contrast, we get to add the details, and we get to define everything, so we are telling more of the defining story of an object. So we are defining the shape, we are defining the features, we are defining pretty much how the entire thing looks, and we are using the base color story as an outline. So where there is green, I am placing harsh lines of green. I'm defining those cream light ridges, and then I can use water to diffuse it just a little bit so it's not completely harsh, but it's still beyond wet on wet and more wet on dry. Often I like to paint a very saturated color, and then I will use water to help me move that color up. So I don't need to place a completely thick, dark, saturated line around that entire light area on the gourd, but I can place a little bit of color and then clean my brush, tap it on the paper towel, and then use my brush to diffuse that color along the space. So that's another trick, especially if everything's feeling really dark. You can always tap your brush, pick that paint back up, move it around, add some water. There's a lot of things you can do, especially if you feel like something isn't working while it's still wet. So on these ridges, for example, in the reference picture, there were some green spots, just light green areas. But as I'm putting paint on those green spots, it feels really harsh. And like I need to soften it just a bit, so I will paint a few of those spots, rinse my brush, and then with water just tap along those hard edges and soften it just a bit. I'm also bringing some of that really harsh, dark color, this saturated color, up into the neck to start forming how those ridges are all coming together in the neck and kind of swirling around. But then here on those ridges, placing the color and then just softening the edge just a tad. So some of those areas are still really harsh. We get a nice harsh line, but we can also add some water to create a soft line as well. Remember that your details are usually in very saturated, contrasting colors, and it can get really overwhelming if you add too much. You do not want to lose the lightness in your painting. So those green spots, I'm just doing a few so that we can still really see the lightness in those ridges, but we have a couple of areas of detail, because sometimes the contrast is what makes those light areas pop even more. So I tried to put a lot of contrast along the sides of the ridges, and then we can do some of that contrast in the center, but we don't want to lose the lightness. Maintain your lightness at all costs. So now I'm adding a little stem to the end of the gourd, but you can see that between all of this contrast, layering wet on wet first, and then wet on dry, it's starting to really come together, and this gourd is forming before our eyes. And it's so crazy to think about how we started. And I just want you to remember that watercolor has so many awkward and ugly stages, but by the time you get to the detail stages, it usually all starts making sense. All right, remember how a few moments ago we painted these little green dots and we softened some of the edges? Well, now you can take a tiny bit of very highly contrasted color and do a tiny little mark inside those areas to increase the contrast and the depth even more. It's one of my favorite little tricks and techniques, because we will have a light value, a medium value, and a dark value just within that grouping of green, and it creates so much depth and perspective in such a tiny area. Now, I already think that this gourd looks great, very 3D, but if you want something to really pop and look really 3D, mix a bunch of your purpley colors together on your palette and paint a little shadow on the side, then it will really pop. I forgot to add the shadow in the gourd, like along the side of the ridges. I end up doing that at the end, and oh my gosh, it makes the whole thing pop. So stay to the end to actually see this gourd completely finished. But isn't it so cute? I asked all of my family which gourd was their favorite. My husband and all of my children said that one on the right. So even though this one on the very left ends up being my favorite, that ended up being the crowd pleaser, I guess. So now we are leaving that one alone on the right side. We've added its little shadow, and we're going to add all of the wet on dry details now to this middle gourd. I love this gourd. I love that it has so many light diffused areas in those green lines. And now we get to take a very highly pigmented concentration of green, maybe mix it with a little bit of indigo, and add some depth into those lines. We can highlight the lines a little bit by adding maybe a streak of color, but we can do lots of really bumpy dots. In the reference picture, there are so many gourds that have lots of warts, I guess you would call them. That's such a gross word, but they're really knobby and textured, and so I really wanted this gourd to look that way. Lots of green circular textures and dots, orange circular textures and dots. I wanted it to have the feeling that if you picked it up, you could really feel the texture on this gourd. So we are focusing some of these concentrated, saturated washes of color where we already placed the wet on wet base layer so that it makes sense. So we're using that as a guide and then dropping in these darker concentrated areas so that they all kind of flow together, so that we have, again, our light, medium, and dark wash within a concentrated area with one color and then other groupings of color next to it. Then we just do the same as the gourd on the right and we add a little bit of a shadow. I loved this middle gourd also because it was a little bit more simple. The colors are really telling the story and create the feeling and shape of that gourd versus having so many ridges and bumps and lines. So now we are going to do the wet on dry details on this one on the left. And again, if I'm being honest, you might be already thinking this, but at this point, I really didn't like this gourd. I thought, what did I do? Why did I pick these really dark, intense colors? And it was not feeling good to me for some reason. But, for the sake of the video, I kept going. And like in the middle one, I'm using the wet on wet base color to kind of define where I put the darker saturated colors. So I'm following the lines that the green have already created to also put in some of those darker orange lines. And then I was creating bumps with a darker green and then now moving up into a darker blue as I'm getting up into the neck. But like I said, I wasn't feeling it. But then I started making bumps along the outside of the neck. And I was like, yes, this one needs so many warts and so much texture because can you see the vision now? Everything changed once I started adding this. So I'm just using this small round size 3 brush and making little whoop, 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 little bumpy motions along the edge. And that's the point where I realized I fixed it, that it all just started to come together. So another lesson, you can really hate something or really not be feeling it. And then one little movement, one little belief in yourself, in your abilities, can change the entire thing. So then I followed that feeling of the bumps along the neck of this gourd and created lots of tinier bumps that kind of go from thicker where they're meeting around the base of the neck to a thinner line as they get closer and closer to that bottom part of the gourd. So I'm really using a lot of concentrated color. I've kind of lost some of that lighter or medium wash that I had in the wet on wet, but I was kind of okay with it because I'm at this point felt like I was trying to save it and create a better story, and I was really happy with it. I love how those bumps look on the right side of the gourd, on the very, very edge, how they're really small and it makes it feel so textured. Anyway, I was very happy with it at this point. So I used a lot of smaller strokes on this one than I did on the middle gourd, and I feel like even though I did a very similar texture story with how I did the strokes, I did smaller strokes. And so they look and feel so different. And I just think that the shape and the curvature and the story of this one spoke the most to me. And maybe it was because there was an initial struggle and I love a good underdog that this one was my favorite. And now I'm adding a little bit of shadow here, and you're going to see me add shadow to all of the gourds on top of them now. So we're going to really finish off the entire piece by adding shadow now that all of the gourds have dried. So we're painting again in this purpley blue color. I just kind of mixed colors together on my palette that I knew would give me a purpley shadow color. I love more of a purple hue. And then I realized we need to add shadows to the sides of the ridges, because if there's a light source coming from the left creating a shadow to the right, we need a shadow to the right of the ridges as well, especially if we want them to look like they're really sticking out. And I absolutely love it. I feel like it completely changed that entire gourd just by having that same shadow color on the side of the ridges. So don't forget your shadows, not just your contrast, but also add your shadows. I did add a little bit of shadow on the side of all of the textured warty areas as well, because even though they're not necessarily ridges, I wanted them to have some kind of shadow so that you could tell that the warts were raised. So they don't need quite as thick of a shadow as the one on the right, but we're just going to do kind of a textured shadow to give a really nice layer of depth to the one in the middle and the one on the left. And those are our finished gourds. We were able to paint this in under 30 minutes, and I think they're quite impressive looking, and we really just used the basic principles of wet on wet and wet on dry. And I know you can do this one, and I can't wait to hear how it goes for you. And I will see you all in my next video. Bye.